I thought to myself, no way. This is too much. Far too much. My life is on the line, and I don't want to die.
In season 1, we met with 4 incredible guests and chronicled their path to finding purpose. In season 2, we're back with 4 more incredible guests, and we're gonna walk through their lowest moments. We're gonna walk through some of their highest triumphs. And I'm Chris Drasbach, and welcome to Repurposed. I think I'm going to start this interview a little bit different because you and I have traveled extensively. We've known each other deeply and personally for a lot of years. Mm-hmm. And instead of, starting with a hard question, I think we should start with the story of, 2016 when we collectively opened Blueprints for Addiction Recovery, our little tiny outpatient in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. And being the marketing geniuses, the gurus that we were in our youth.
Yeah.
What did we do? I want you to tell the story because I think it's a good, light, humorous way to start.
Well, we traveled far and wide. As you said, we had there were 5 of us in our little outpatient clinic in a shared office building in Elizabethtown Borough, providing intensive outpatient services and weekly limited outpatient individual and group psychotherapy. It was a small outfit, a few of us with big dreams on a big mission, and you and I decided the world, far and wide, needed to hear about it. So we'd rent vehicles, we'd travel 10 hours straight to Cincinnati, we jumped on a plane and went to Jacksonville, Florida to do a podcast interview to talk about the vital need in central and northern Florida that we could fill in our outpatient office in Elizabethtown Borough. And we had a lot of hilarious stories. We stayed in hotels that probably cost $10, $15 a night just to survive and wake up the next day to go visit another facility and get our message out there and communicate our mission. And we joke and we have a lot of hilarious inside jokes about some of those trips and stories, but there's a deadly seriousness to that errand as well. Even though we were out of the way, our plan was to expand these programs and services to become a viable continuing care option for people really all across the country. So we wanted to let them know early, before it was practical at all to send a referral.
I thought it was important to start with a little bit of levity and a little bit of silliness because, the number of hours that you and I have spent in the trenches just figuring out what we could do to impact others, to give them and their lives a sense of purpose that we may not have even fully understood at the beginning. I think it's really telling that here in 2024, we get to sit down and have this discussion about you and about your life and what drives you in your purpose. So let's kick it off in a more logical way and talk about your early life. Talk about the things that led you to substance use. Talk about the things that may have happened to you, both positive and negative, that led you towards recovery.
Absolutely. Well, I am, as you often point out, a young man. I'm only 31 now. I was born in 1992, and my family's originally from the mountains in North Georgia. I was born in a town called Ellijay, Georgia, in Chattahoochee National Forest, which at the time there was our house, another house about a mile away, and a Jeep dealership, and that's about it. Now it's a destination retirement mountain cabin town. But my story really is, my experience is unorthodox in some ways and universal in many other ways. The nature of the things that I've experienced, the nature of my illness, the nature of my substance use disorder, the nature of my recovery is not unique, which is why I believe I have been blessed to be put in a position to be of use to so many people in so many of the years since this recovery journey began. I was born into a deeply connected, spiritual, and religious, but deeply spiritual family. I was a mountain child. Ellijay, Georgia, if you don't know anything about it, the movie Deliverance was filmed about 20-ish minutes away from Ellijay in Blue Ridge, Georgia. So mountain town. Wake up and there's, you got to take your trash in or the black bears will eat it. And you wake up and there's bobcats on your porch railings. But my family, I have 2 brothers, no sisters, 2 brothers. My parents were, as I said, deeply principled, spiritual human beings who were committed above everything else to provide and cultivate a life of real substance and clarity and principle and love. And I was born into that family where there was no active substance use or abuse in my immediate family. There's some on my father's side, but we were raised on principles. The golden rule has been embedded in my DNA as far back as my name has been. I was homeschooled until 4th grade when I finally went into public school, so I was a weird homeschool kid. I probably still carry a little bit of that with me, but I say all that to say we were a close-knit family that didn't really go outside of our box. We shared the same conceptions of God and faith. We shared the same prayers before every meal and before bed and every morning. I was raised on an overtly religious homeschooling curriculum. And I'm emphasizing that dimension of my childhood because when I do get into the nature of my recovery experience, I often state very boldly that it is nothing more, less, or other than spiritual in its nature. And by that I mean it has to do with what I am. There is such a profound element of transformation, which to me is always a spiritual dialogue. I have no great tragedy, no profound trauma in my very early youth. Later on, and I'll get into this in a minute, later on as I moved into experimentation and indulging in different substances that I found and then pushing it as hard and as fast as I could to the ends of the earth, and nearly on a few occasions to the end of my life, I would struggle when I was first introduced in therapy sessions and in counseling and in trying to explore what was going on when I was still very young, because I got into recovery very young, trying to figure out what it was that led me into a path of substance use disorder. Any clarity I really have is a result of the combined practice of vital, tested principles in recovery and the good work of many people who knew what they were talking about and joined together to provide me some kind of a solution. What drove me into experimentation with substances of abuse was not external at all. As far back as I can remember, growing up, even in that close-knit, deeply unified, deeply spiritual, principled, and they lived it. They didn't just talk the talk. I was exposed to and had incredible role models in my parents. I had great relationships with my brothers. But as far back as I can remember, consciously remember anyway, maybe it's because I'm a middle child, but it seems a little bit more significant than that. There was this growing, gnawing sense of anxious apartness as I grew into myself and into my mind and into my experience of the world. I started to doubt and question the things I'd been taught as a young child spiritually, and I started to feel and fear and engage with life in a way that was uncomfortable. And the more and more I grew, and I got into public school when I was, like I said, moving into 4th grade, and met other people with varied experiences and varied backgrounds that challenged all these things I thought I knew about myself, about the world, about other people. And it seemed like every time I would grow, step into some new season of my life, there came with it this restless, anxious, desperately internal knot. It was growing and growing and growing. Jumping ahead for a while, I remember one of the first counselors I ever worked with was talking to me about how I was probably 12 or 13, and she was talking to me and just mentioned in passing how, most people don't ruminate before they fall asleep. And I said, what do you mean? She's like, play little dramas out in their head to fall asleep. And I was like, well, what do you mean? How do they fall asleep? She said, they just lie down and close their eyes, and after a few minutes, they fall off into sleep. What are you talking about? And I was flabbergasted, you know what I mean? As far as I was concerned, the only way a person falls asleep is that they think themselves into exhaustion until they pass out and then roll over with their alarm clock going off at 6 o'clock in the morning to get ready for school. Because as soon as I started to meet people and move into puberty and grow into myself, there was this knot, like I was talking about, that grew and wore all kinds of costumes and faces. And everywhere I went, I seemed to be thinking too much, too often about too many things that I didn't want to share with other people or they didn't want to think about or talk about. And the more and more I lived, the more and more I lived in my head. And not intentionally, not consciously grew apart from the people that I knew and met and my friends and my family in this little inner world that was frightening and deeply isolated. If you were to ask me, as far as I could tell, that's just life. That's what it is to grow up. I had no comparison. My family starts to get concerned about me and for me because I'm that kid who's in my room or disappears for hours at a time, deep in my room and alone, days at a time. And it's just not quite enoughness everywhere I went. And I remember very distinctly, and I'll never forget it, one night, my older brother, and he was my older brother, I always wanted to be a part of, with my older brother, and I had to be 12 years old. I remember my family had moved away from the mountains into the suburbs of Atlanta. My older brother was with one of his friends from the neighborhood, and they'd gotten their hands on some disgusting room temperature bottle of vodka, and they were down in the basement. And all I wanted to do was to be, in with my older brother and his friend, because I was just this scrawny, meek, overly self-serious, hugely anxious, living in my head kid. And what's the key? The key to that door is to be in with my brother and his friends, my older brother and his friends. And so they graciously let me participate in their, debauchery down in the basement. And I remember vividly that I took this, what had, about an inch left in the bottom of this bottle of vodka, and I picked it up, it was room temperature, disgusting, some terrible brand of vodka, and threw it back. And I remember, as soon as it took effect, I began to laugh. Almost maniacally, I was laughing. And I now look back and I reflect after the work that I've been able to do in myself and with the help of so many of the great mentors, teachers, counselors that have worked with me throughout my life, that what I felt was a tremendous sense of relief and release from an unraveling of that impossible, almost unintelligible knot. It's almost like this second birth I had, or I felt that I had at the time, that, I'm finally in a position to just hang out with my older brother and his friend. But it was far more than that to me. I had an experience when I took a real drink of alcohol for the first time that, not consciously, that I know now that I essentially unconsciously sold out in pursuit of, no matter what would come down the road. Because that scrawny, ill at ease, restless, anxious, quick to anger, frightened little kid was almost instantaneously transformed into just one of the rest of you. I began in my limited capacity as a 12-year-old to pursue as hard and as often as I could access to anything that would get me there. High, drunk, whatever. I sometimes think about this. There might have been a tiny little window between that drink and a true crossing over the line into a true substance use disorder, crossing over the line into true alcoholism or addiction. But I have no idea if there was that window, and I wouldn't have been interested in taking a step out or taking a step back or putting the brakes on, because as far as I was concerned, that experience was worth anything. In recovery, as you know, and we've talked about many times, we talk about how people like me, and I continue to observe this, the rest of my immediate family don't have this problem. My wife doesn't have this problem. Many, many people that I've met don't have the relationship to drugs and alcohol that I had. And I was sure after I took that first drink that this is why people do this all the time. There's something absolutely essential. It's inconceivable to me that a person wouldn't add that experience to their lives, because it's almost like this key turning the lock in the door that makes it possible to just inhabit my body and become friendly with my own mind in a way that I didn't even know was possible. I now know, I've known for a long time, that I have a different relationship, a deeply spiritual relationship with the effects produced by drugs and alcohol. And by that I mean the inside job that alcohol did on me was worth anything. That sense of ease and comfort, that freedom from fear, anxiety, social anxiety, self-preoccupation, overthinking, intrusive thoughts, it was almost eradicated. I just thought, how am I going to do this as often as possible, in as many situations as possible? it was an unregulated environment down there in Georgia in the in the early 2000s, I guess. And so I got my hands on drugs and alcohol as often as I could to pursue that blessed state of deep breath that I was able to achieve or was gifted to me by alcohol. That's how I saw it. It radically pushed me into this transformation into a very, very dark and far more deeply isolated place than I had ever been. It's almost like two conversations. I have this experience when I get drunk or high that makes me feel that I can fully inhabit myself and the moment, because that's what it felt like. It felt like for the first time I could take a drink or smoke something or crush something up and snort it or take something and chew it up and swig it back down with alcohol, whatever it was going to take, that when it finally hit, there was this cool, quiet, expansive spaciousness. And in that space, I could do anything. I was the artist I wanted to be. I was the musician I wanted to be. I was the storyteller I wanted to be. I was the friend I wanted to be. I wasn't the creep that I was afraid I was with all the girls I wanted to get to know. And so I felt alive, but in that, I was content to live in my own little world and aggressively isolated myself from just about everyone that had any real investment in my health or in my sanity or in my happiness. I pushed and pushed and pushed and got my hands on as many drugs as I could, took them as often as I could with absolutely no regard. I had no I was a kid. I had no conception of the danger that I was in, and frankly, I wouldn't have cared.
So let's talk a little bit more about your first experience with overdose. I think around age 14, you said?
Mm-hmm. There might even have a picture of it that my family kept to try and remind themselves of how horrible this could get, and to remind me. And unfortunately, that kind of thing isn't enough. But when I was 14, I was always young for my grade. I think I might have just gotten into my sophomore year of high school. It was just another day. And by that I mean I woke up as early as possible and had some alcohol stashed in some plastic bottle in my closet, drank it, some Ziploc bag with whatever I had gotten my hands on and had a pile of in my room, took as much of it as felt reasonable, and made my way to school as a 14-year-old kid. And throughout that day, I'm just continuing because that is the nature of my reaction to these substances of abuse. I have to get to a place where I'm divorced. I either run out or I'm physically separated. But that day, I happen to have consistent access to a whole bunch of substances that ought not to be mixed together. And I just took them all throughout the day, went home as I usually do, and at the end of the day, well, I don't know, whatever the end of the day was back then, I would fall essentially unconscious a couple hours after I got home from school. And the next thing I remember was my mother on my chest, pounding it as hard as she could, screaming, "Wake up," in my face. And then I'm out again. And there's these flashes of memory where paramedics are in the room, they're bringing me back with helping me stumbling down the hallway. Then I'm out again. I come to, I'm in DuPont Children's Hospital, because I'm 14 years old, in Delaware. I come to because they're inserting a catheter. That'll bring you around. And then I'm out again.
Quickly.
I'm out again. And then when I come to, I'm in the ICU. And I'm in the ICU for 3 days. I can't feel the bottoms of my feet. I had begun to experience nerve damage. I come to learn all this afterwards. And my family, they're coming in and out. My parents won't leave my side. One of them is there at all times, while the other one's with my brothers. And the most remarkable thing about that time, I could not access or internalize, not truly, what I was in the face of. I mean, the truth is, if I was out for another 45 minutes or an hour, there was really no certainty whether I was going to be able to be brought around again. I didn't have feeling in the bottom of my feet for another year, and then for a few years after that, all I felt was consistent burning in my feet as my nerves found their way again. Fortunately, I was young enough, my body had a lot of rebuilding to do. This was a turning point in my experience in two ways. It began this constant interaction with counselors, outpatient therapy and intensive outpatient therapy. I'd come back from the hospital and my family didn't know anything about substance use disorder. Nobody even suggested that I go away to an adolescent inpatient program or anything like that because they were just scandalized. They were horrified by what had happened. And, while I was in the hospital, they went through my room and found out what had been happening and what was probably bound to happen again if nothing great changed. But they didn't have the tools. They had not been exposed to or educated on substance use disorder or substance misuse in any way, or what treatment services really even were. So after this overdose, I was just locked in my house and not allowed to go out. And I went through a pretty vicious physical withdrawal just on my own. Fortunately, it wasn't potentially fatal, but it was, oh man, it was brutal. And I recall distinctly in that state of just vicious physical agony, emotional and psychological anguish, and after seeing the faces of my parents in and out of that hospital and the days that followed, where they weren't sure who it was that was on the couch, tossing around, constantly sweating, angry, irritable, frighteningly sick, I thought to myself, no way. This is too much, far too much. My life is on the line, and I don't want to die. Because I don't. I don't want to live without drugs and alcohol because I cannot return to that knot, living with that knot, conceding to live with that knot. I was supposed to be in control of this. I didn't know I could be in a position where I just go to bed and I essentially wake up 4 or 5 days later in a hospital. And so I began to get engaged with counseling in limited ways. My parents are asking, their friends at church and people that they know what kind of help is available for stuff like this. So after I was in the house for a couple weeks, I was no longer in a position to go inpatient. So I started in intensive outpatient day treatment programs and started to get exposed to this conversation about recovery, meeting people, connecting with this idea that there's a community of people who have this problem and do something about it, and their lives change. And I'm using all this kind of mercurial language because I was a 14-year-old kid. I was not interested in accessing that conversation. I didn't have the self-awareness. In my mind, I had to figure out some balance because, again, I'd scan around as I ingested and these drugs of abuse and went too far just about every time. And it's obvious to me that other people I know, friends of mine, my brothers, my parents, their parents, didn't do this. They didn't drink and do drugs the way that I did, and I couldn't understand why. And eventually I had to concede that we're not the same. So I begin to guard this blessed secret. I feel like I have this magic key in the effects that drugs and alcohol have on me that I can never really express to anyone. I can never really say, Mom, I know it doesn't make sense to you, but I do this because it's the only thing that makes me feel enough like me to go to school or be out in the world or inhabit my body and my mind. I wasn't in a position to even conceive of life without grabbing something and on my own volition ingesting it and remedying that impossible internal situation. The idea of just being without drugs and alcohol of any kind, even at that age, was unacceptable to me. Because as far as I was concerned, whether it was normal life or not, or whether I was different or not, or whether I was a freak or not, normal life is an intolerable situation. So I'm not going to do it. No. So I began to keep this secret. So I would try to do this dance, try to control and get just there enough, get just well enough, get just enough spaciousness to participate in life, but not take it over the line and not scare anybody. I don't want to hurt my family. I don't want my mom to find me dead in the basement. I don't want to break my father's heart, who came from a fragmented family, and the only thing that ever motivated him in life, everything he committed himself to, was to create a safe place to grow and nurture a family. I didn't want to break their hearts. I didn't want my younger brother to be awoken by my death rattle in the room next to his and come over, not be able to wake me up, because this is, of course, what I found out happened in the overdose. And then not be able to wake me up and get my older brother, and they're throwing ice water on me. Then they have to wake up my parents. I don't want to traumatize my family. So I'm just going to manage this thing. Because for God's sake, it's a choice. It's a decision I'm making. I just have to be more responsible about it.
So let me interject there real quick.
Please.
With all of your heart and all of your soul, you believed that you could manage it.
Of course.
Because there is no other option. There's not a plan B. There's not a plan C or a plan D. It's just life. And I feel like there's a lot of folks who are in that position where they don't even understand that there is a way out,
Right.
that there is another option besides management. And I wanted to stop and make sure that we drove that point home, because people who are watching this could potentially be stuck in that exact moment where you were, that same moment that I myself have felt and so many of our brothers and sisters in recovery have felt. And I just wanted to stop and make sure that that point was driven home. If you feel the way that Ben is talking about right now, there are other options that are available literally everywhere.
Absolutely. And the next key, I say it was a turning point because it began the dialogue of this has to stop, this has to change. But within another, I think, 2 years, because I was 16 going on 17 when I actually came into recovery in 2008. But I was trying to manage. And as you said, that was the only option I thought I had, because it's either live as me, I'm not willing to do that with all of you, not willing to do that in this world, not willing to do that, or make it tolerable, make it possible, and hopefully every once in a while, maybe I can get back to that cool, quiet, spacious place that I was gifted by that room temperature bottle of vodka when I was 12 years old. Of course, it never happened, but with the twists of the mind and the absolute hurdles that my limbic system's going to go through to shut my frontal lobe off, we'll say, we'll get there, the right time and the right place. So I attempted to manage, and it got worse all the time. And I broke their hearts again and again and again, because the nature of my relationship to drugs and alcohol is not only that there are other options, of course there are options, and that's the only reason I'm alive. It's the reason we know each other. The work we do is to make those options available to people.
Why don't we talk a little bit about getting sober early, entering recovery early, because we've done, this is season 2, and we've had a pretty broad group of individuals as part of Repurposed so far. We had Paul Fletcher, the Major League Baseball pitcher, in season 1, episode 4, and he didn't even really start his drinking journey until he was a professional baseball player. That was well past the age of 16, and I feel like it's telling and kind of great and broad how different everybody's story is. So let's talk a little bit more about getting into recovery that early at 16, 17, because I think there are a lot of people in that 17, 18 age range who think, oh no, like my life without substances is going to be such a nightmare. It's going to be droll and boring and drab and terrible.
Right.
Can you illustrate a few points about how it's not like that at all?
Absolutely. If I can tell one brief story, the watershed moment for me was that I had an experience, and I began to do that dance where I said, well, I'm going to manage, I'm going to control, here and there, there's some vital family encounter. And I remember distinctly, I had one family engagement that I needed to show up to, and I needed to be clean for it. I needed to be present for it. And so I had all of my human resources gathered together and pointed at this. Show up, tolerate, feign interest, pretend, survive, get home, do what you have to do. And I couldn't pull it off. Again, I couldn't pull it off. And in this particular case, that subtle twist of the mind that is universal to people with my experience grabbed me, rug pulled me, and I ended up drunk, and then I ended up high, and I ended up essentially on a run. And the whole family was there, and the house of cards comes down again. They realize nothing has changed again. And I tell that story, which is like so many others, because the couple days later, when I was back in my bedroom and conscious, it finally occurred to me that there was a thought in my own mind smarter than I am, and that there is something going on in me in my relationship to drugs and alcohol. Remember, I had heard these things because I'd been exposed to counseling and outpatient therapy and even recovery in limited sort of, third-party ways. And I thought, oh man, I don't think that even when I put everything I have at this, there are going to be times when I'm just not at all in charge. And it terrified me to my core, because the only thing that had ever allowed me to feel secure in the growing insanity that was my life was my confidence in my own ability. And in this case, it was over. I conceded unconsciously to myself that there was something in me that was going to continue to get worse unless I began to participate with any real intention in change, whatever it meant. And so I actually went to my mom and said, hey, I need to get involved in some sort of program again, because I had, successfully or unsuccessfully graduated however many limited outpatients, And I said, I need to get involved in some program again. So I had made a decision to do something, to make this change. And a friend of mine, he was 17 as well at the time, had just gotten out of a long-term adolescent inpatient program. And I went to him, because before this I'd been, I was like, I can't associate with him anymore because he's all involved in this recovery now with this. So I reached out to him, weighing whatever 20 pounds I weighed or something at the time, and said, hey man, can you take me to one of these recovery meetings you go to? And of course he was ecstatic and he was like, I would love nothing more. And so it's November of 2008. So it's cold, it's Pennsylvania, it's November of 2008. I am as white as a sheet, as I often am, because I never leave my room. I'm wearing huge sunglasses. My greasy hair is half chopped off with kitchen scissors, and the rest of it's over one of my eyes. And I go into a recovery clubhouse meeting that my friend brings me into. It's dark. It's 8 o'clock at night, so I got my big sunglasses on while it's dark outside. And I sit inside. I sit down at this strange gathering, because I'd never actually gone to a recovery meeting before. And he brought me there. He's ecstatic. It's infuriating. But I want to see what this thing is about, because I now know that there is a fuse burning out until I end up doing again what I did before. And however many more times I might survive coming to in a hospital, there will eventually be that time that I don't. And again, despite all of my behavior, I didn't want to die. And I'm far and away the youngest person in the room. And I didn't say anything, of course. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't introduce myself to anyone. But I remember the meeting started, and it was a men's meeting. I don't have any recollection of what the topic was. I don't have any recollection of what the format was. But I remember, and I will always remember, that once the meeting kicked off and all of these men began to share, they were sharing my thoughts out loud, freely, with each other, with laughter and a sort of self-possession and contentment that was foreign to me. But the most remarkable thing is that they were speaking in a way that made it clear to me that their minds worked like mine. And I knew from that moment on, that was in November of 2008, that these were my people. They were saying my thoughts out loud. They didn't have to text me. I didn't have to do a biopsychosocial evaluation. They didn't ask me for a copay, nothing. They weren't prescribing. They weren't theorizing. They were sharing their own experience, and it happened to be my own, internally. What it was like to live with that knot, that wound up clock, and only experience a sense of ease and comfort with the effects produced by alcohol until they found recovery. And I've gone through, my experience in recovery has been season after season, surrender after surrender. I've grown up in recovery. My life has taken its shape in recovery. I've experienced the most profound and dramatic sufferings and traumas in recovery. And I've gone through incredible periods of challenge, but it has never occurred to me not to be involved in this community of people. From the day that they allowed me to meet them as they were and didn't ask me to be anybody other than the weird kid with sunglasses that I was, and waited for me to make my way into that fellowship truly, it has never occurred to me to spend my life outside of that community. And so I was young, very young, and really in the wake of myself and that friend of mine, a whole bunch of other young people who I had been running around with and who knew me and saw that example got involved. Because exactly as you were saying, in their minds, they were just trying to grow up. They saw us begin to get just surrounded, hugged by this community of people who were from all walks of life. People I never would have, in a million years, bet I would be spending as many evenings as I could with. And so I'm involved in treatment programs again, and I'm deeply involved in this recovery community. I remember going out of my way to go to as many meetings as I could to just be with these people, because it was this revelation that I was not some alien waiting for the mothership. Rather, that there were people, fascinatingly strange, deeply loving, incredibly capable, intelligent, and more than anything else, apparently happy people who were like me and sober. And so it began this rocket ship ride that I've essentially been on ever since.
How powerful and impactful was the moment that you realized you weren't alone? That's another thing that we don't always talk about is the loneliness, that crippling feeling of being the only person on earth who feels the way that you feel. And I think I'd really like to know how powerful that moment was for you when you realized you weren't alone because of all these fascinating, interesting people that you got to meet.
Well, very simply, I don't know that there has been a single more significant experience in my life. So many people, myself included, consider that knot. I experience that knot as aloneness, and often loneliness. There's a line in one of the books in recovery that describes the state of anxious apartness. That would be the first half of my autobiography, anxious apartness. But this idea that I am alien and other and forever apart from and trying to be a part of, and I'm on the outside looking through the window at life where people seem to live and laugh and work and know each other and engage in friendships and get in relationships and grow up almost effortlessly, it seems, in my removed self-centeredness. It looks effortless and to me impossible. And the harder I push, the roles I play, the characters I assign them and myself, the attitudes I adopt, the behaviors I try to mimic, just to attempt to live a life where I can feel the way it looks like they all feel. And the harder I push, I come to the next morning and the smoke clears and I'm further away than ever before. And that moment, when those men, without my consent, without my approval, without any hurdles to jump through, disarmed me and shattered that invisible shield that kept me separate from everyone and let me know at least that these people are like me. And it was like a homecoming. My life has been about growing that authentic fellowship and making that experience as possible for other people as I can. Because there is no recovery in isolation. And for me, the principles of recovery are not new. They weren't coined or invented when any single recovery fellowship was formed, or, the principles that underlie some of the most effective interventions delivered in therapeutic settings are not new. They're delivered or administered in unique ways with unique sensitivities. I say that to say a lot of the principles of recovery, like I mentioned, I've been exposed to since I was born. My family lived them. The golden rule is deeply embedded in my DNA. The issue's never been that I didn't want to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. It's that no matter how hard I tried, I can't seem to live up to or inhabit or embrace this way of life that I wish I could, because I'm just too separate, different, and alone. And what those men did was disarm me of my prejudice and my fear, and that invisible wall shattered it so that it became possible for me to access a way of life that I had longed for, probably unknowingly, but longed for as far back as I could remember. It became possible to change.
So now that the wall has been shattered, the wall's beginning to shatter at the very least, let's talk about what happened in your life. What brought you to where you are today? What brought you to your purpose? What brought you to the things that make you tick?
In recovery, I experienced transformation. That anxious apartness that we were just talking about. It's like I couldn't reach out of my head far enough to touch the world or any of the people in it in any kind of meaningful way. It's as if I couldn't make a difference anywhere I went, or the difference I made was only negative. It was never my motivation to take something beautiful and make it hideous, to take something whole and rip it to shreds, and yet time and time again, the way that I lived or the things that I conceded I must do to get that thing that I needed to get forced me, was my attitude, to take those beautiful things and make them hideous. But once recovery began, that all began to truly change. As I said, I got access to a real transformation, not just in my behavior. I can mimic behavioral changes. I could put on a costume of changing my behavior in front of people to appease them temporarily here and there, but the rug would always get pulled. The house of cards would always fall down. Recovery made it possible for me to embrace a way of life that affected real change in me, as far as I'm concerned, in my nature, in my attitude, in my principles. Life began to get full and brilliant fast. And my life filled up with friends, real, deep, and authentic friendships. You know, those recovery friendships, the kind of friendships you forge over a cigarette and a cup of black coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning in 5 minutes that it seems most people spend decades just trying to find out are possible. We're united in this implicit sense that we have seen places in our own minds, in our own hearts, in the world, in our families, in our homes, in communities. We've seen devastation that's brought us to places we don't even have the words for. And it's this unspoken, immediate sense of real connection. And then beyond that, not only have we seen the same and darkest places, we find this galvanizing truth together. I was changed in recovery, and these people surrounded me, picked me up, walked with me, shared with me their lives, their time, their experience. My life and my heart began to fill, my mind began to quiet. I began to see myself becoming what my 5 and 6 and 7 and 8-year-old self would have loved to have seen me becoming. As a result of the profound transformation that I experienced in recovery, there was born in me an absolutely overwhelming desire to make that as possible as I could for as many people as I possibly could. You know, I have a lot of experience in 12-step recovery fellowships. There's this saying that my recovery experience doesn't begin with the first step, but rather with the 12th step in someone else's heart. Because I cannot do this thing alone. I cannot come to these awakenings alone. I can't go through the process of self-examination and real change, which is oftentimes tremendously painful, like stripping off layers of skin to find out, to recover what I really am and what I'm really capable of. I can't do that without the authentic love that often takes the form of action and camaraderie and fellowship and plenty of laughter and plenty of, just outrageous, raw, we're alive and we can't believe it experiences as recovery begins to take shape. But beneath all that fun, and recovery is incredibly fun. I mean, think about it. An entire society of people like us. It's incredibly fun. But there's this deadly seriousness that underpins everything. Because as much as this key was turned in this door that made it possible for me to live a life that is impossible to explain in its beauty and in its simplicity and in its richness, just behind me, before I crossed that threshold, was death, real death, that we are overwhelmed by all the time. Kids, much younger than I was when I got sober, dying of the same substance use disorder that I recover from. So there's this sense of duty, but it's not this arduous duty. It's not work at all. It is the greatest gift of my life that because of the love of others, I am in a position to transmit that love into the lives of people like me and hopefully transmute their suffering into that same usefulness for countless others. And so I got involved in working professionally. Not long after I got sober myself, I got involved in whatever job I could get that would put me in front of people like me where we could be about this work. In all the off hours, it was just this all the time. As my life began to grow and take shape, I began to grow in my capacity, in my usefulness, in my awareness of all the range of complex sufferings. People cross the door into recovery, carrying with them. I began to pursue as comprehensively as I could whatever skills, whatever experience, whatever inside work I needed to make myself as useful to them as possible. I found myself working professionally in behavioral health care and substance use disorder treatment, even as my life filled outside of work with recovery all the time. My life is characterized by the experiences I've had in recovery, because to me, recovery doesn't happen inside of a room with 15 people who don't say their last names. Recovery is a way of life. We work in treatment. We work in trying to create a bridge from sickness and disorder into recovery, this lifelong pursuit of self-actualization and transcendence, of a full heart and a quiet mind and a full life. and a rich one. So just about every major season of my life as it has continued to transform has been characterized by some great change brought about by the endless work that is recovery, inside myself, outside of myself, with others, in communities outside of those rooms where we meet and we share, in formal, professional, or clinical environments and outside of them. Recovery has given me 3 beautiful children, a wife, my life, a host of friends, and a profound purpose.
So for the 16-year-old, 17-year-old, the young person right now who's struggling, you want to tell them what life as a 30-plus, I know you're ancient.
Yeah.
You want to tell that 16 or 17-year-old who's struggling and feeling lost, even the 18, 19, 20 like I was when I got sober, talk about what your life is like now that you're in your 30s, that you're ancient and starting to gray.
Yes.
Tell them about what your life is like and how beautiful it can be.
Now that I've crested the hill into old age.
Yes.
Well, I mean, how many interviews have you done? There isn't one, I'm sure, that hasn't said, my life is indeed beyond my wildest dreams.
It's a common phrase. It's a really common phrase, and it hits me every single time because it's real. Mm-hmm. And when I used to not feel that deeply, I used to think what a crock of bull poo that could be. Because like, oh, your life is so fabulous because you're sober. Woo, right. Yeah, sure it is. But like now that my life is beyond my wildest dreams and incredible, I feel it deeply. But for those of us who don't believe life can be that beautiful, tell us about it. Tell us why it is and how it is.
Well, I'll tell you 2 things. One, it is full. It is full of people and of opportunity. And there's been great success. There's been great opportunity that's followed by great success. I'm able to work in the capacity I do now as the Chief Executive Officer of Blueprints for Addiction Recovery to build programs that are a bridge into this way of life. My life is full. But here's what I want to say to me at 16, 17, 18, 19. Not only is my life full, but my heart is full, and my mind is quiet. I do not think myself into exhaustion to fall asleep. My cup is full of good, real things. And where it's surrounded by the tragedy that comes with the work we do, there are so many recoveries, so many miracles that I witness every day. But to that 16 or 17-year-old, you can come to live a life that makes sense to you, that is good and free and real and quiet and peaceful. When I experience the effects produced by alcohol, I often say I had the store-bought synthetic version of an experience of peace. The closest thing I could get to the real thing. Recovery is the real thing. I sold my life out in pursuit of that experience of relief from the impossible internal condition that I was sure was just life. I didn't know, as we talked about earlier, that there was anything else. But I now come to know this. What I loved about drugs and alcohol is not what they did to my brain or to my body. My body rejects alcohol and drugs in the amounts that I would take them in. I didn't get drunk for a warm stomach and a bunch of regrettable voicemails in unfortunate situations. I was obsessed not with what these things did to my brain or to my body, but what they did for my consciousness. The sense of spaciousness and ease and comfort and certainty, and honestly, what looked to me at the time like purpose, that they made it possible for me to experience. So what I will say is what I did not believe when I walked in the doors of recovery, because as people will mention, I wouldn't trade my worst day sober for my best day drunk, they'll say. And I was rightly skeptical, and I thought, what are you talking about? Because my best day drunk was the first time I ever felt like I belonged in my own body with my own mind in this world. But I now know what they mean. What they mean is exactly that. That spaciousness that alcohol and drugs temporarily, briefly, brilliantly provided for me, recovery gives to me day after day after day after day after day. A life of contentment, sanity, peace, real joy, and usefulness. So my life is full and busy, very full. We're all over the place. I have the opportunity to do great work for great people all the time. But what registers with me at a cellular level is the quiet at the end of the day, when I'm me, doing whatever I'm doing, wherever I am, with whoever I'm with, and I don't feel that intolerable need to be somebody else, somewhere else, doing something else, where I'm not quite there yet, over this hill and around this corner, and after this purchase, and after this drunk, and after this high, and after this relationship, and after this thing, I'll finally be there, I'll finally get there, and every time I push, the further away I feel. Recovery, as impossible as it may seem, is a gateway to a way of life that eradicates that endless wanting and fills my life with finding every day. We seek and we never stop, but every day that we seek, we find. I can look into the eyes of my children and see them. I can see everything. I can look into my own eyes in my reflection in the mirror and see what I'm sure my parents saw when I was a 4 or 5-year-old kid and they looked in my eyes. We use language, I think, in recovery that almost sounds, it's very too good to be true language we use in recovery. A lot of superlative statements about freedom and transformation, but it's all real. It's all real. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not just possible, it's my birthright. Recovery, as a human being, I'm entitled to the peace, serenity, security, purpose, and love that recovery, in my case, make possible for people like me. It's not an exclusive club. I've never met a human being that didn't deserve to be happy, but this is my way in, and these are my people. And when we do this thing together, stuff that I stopped believing was even possible when I was a 4-year-old kid and climbed trees just because, and lived because, for the sake of life, I now get to live for the sake of life, because it's good enough. And beyond that, there's work to do. Wasn't really a party for any of us. It was, more like a Radiohead song. But